Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm here to talk about the BookTube Prize Octafinals, which I judged. And this is my third year, I think, yes, of judging the BookTube Prize. But the big twist, is that usually, at least in the past 2 times that I've done the BookTube Prize, I only judged the nonfiction sections. But this year, I decided to mix things up a little, and I signed up to judge both the fiction sections and the nonfiction sections. And so for this first round, the Octafinals, I judged the fiction. The reason why I decided to do this is not because I'm sick of nonfiction. I love nonfiction, still do it for Nonfiction Book Club, still am going to be judging it for this current ongoing round of the BookTube Prize. But basically, actually, the reason why I decided to do this is because I have loved judging the nonfiction section so much, and I was like, why don't I see if the things that I have loved about judging the nonfiction section will kind of apply to judging the fiction section as well. And really in particular, what judging the nonfiction sections have done for me is gotten me to read a lot of nonfiction I might not have known about otherwise, and also really helped me kind of think more about what it is I want from my nonfiction and to be able to articulate to myself what it is that makes, to me, a good nonfiction book versus a bad one, and to kind of figure out, how do you rank them and stuff. So yeah, it's been a really good experience for me in the nonfiction reading realm of my life. But something I've talked about in my channel quite a bit at this point is that over the past few years, I really feel like I just haven't been reading as much fiction. Most of my fiction reading is romance. So in general, really most of my reading is nonfiction or romance. And I have been wanting to branch out from that and kind of just on my own having a tough time, just because I'm kind of staring at all this fiction and just being I don't even know. It's just been so long since I've really committed to reading a lot of fiction that's not romance that I just I don't even know what it is I'm looking for anymore. And I feel like that's obviously bad for my fiction reading, but I actually kind of think it's getting a little bit bad for my romance reading and my nonfiction reading too, just because I'm so hunkered down in those categories that I feel like my reading is starting to get a little samey and just, I don't know. Reading for me is at its best when it's something that is challenging but fun, right? And part of it is just in the past 2 years, I haven't really been wanting challenging, and that's fine. My headspace is a little bit different, but right now, kind of want to branch out a little bit more, and I figured, why not use the BookTube Prize to do that a little bit? If you'll just bear with me for a second, I just want to get some kind of navel-gazy, big picture thoughts about what the experience was like first, kind of out of the way. So when I started this channel, I used to read a lot more fiction, I used to review a lot more, and so I know that I am capable, just at a fundamental level, of articulating thoughts about fiction. With that said, I still went into this with a little bit of imposter syndrome of should I be the one to be judging this? Who am I to judge here, right? Because it's been so long. And I will say that compared to judging the nonfiction sections, where I do feel even though that it's helped me get better at articulating what I like about nonfiction, I still went in with a baseline confidence in my ability to do that, right? So that was just gonna inherently be a little bit different off the bat. And it was also apparent as I was going through this experience of reading these different books and kind of realizing just how immediately I have thoughts about the nonfiction books I read and what they're doing, whereas with these fiction books, I had to kind of give it a little bit more time, think through it a little bit more, be a little bit more patient with the books to kind of understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, all of that stuff. And this is actually weirdly, I think, most apparent in the fact that there weren't any books in this section that I strongly hated. I was pretty okay with any of these books from this section making it to the next round. And it could just be that these books are all very, very good. I think they are pretty quality. But the thing is that I think the nonfiction books are all mostly pretty quality, and yet there are books in every round that I have strong feelings about and that I am no, I do not like this book. And it's much more apparent to me, and usually much more sooner, why I don't like that book. And I just didn't have as much of that clear of a sense of any of that, I guess, with reading these fiction books. But that's also, again, why I'm glad I did this. I think it was a really good experience for me to kind of sit down with the books, both in the process of reading them, in the process of ranking them, and now again, in the process of making this video, to think about, again, why it is that I had a certain immediate reaction to these books, even if it wasn't as sharp as I have with a nonfiction book. It was good to sit down with those thoughts and feelings and kind of just figure out what it is, because it's just been so long since I've done that for books that are not romance and nonfiction. I was in group B of the fiction section, so the books that I had to read were Either Or by Elif Batuman, The Book of Goose by Yian Li, Vagabonds by Elagosa Osunde, Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout, The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and Take My Hand by Dolan Perkins Valdez. So I'm going to go in order for when I ranked my least favorite to my most favorite, but I want to reiterate that I actually didn't strongly hate any of these books, and I felt like as I was reading them that I could make a case for any of them making it to the next round. So if something is ranked low and you loved it, don't think that means that I hate it, because at least in this context, that's not what it means. And usually, if I hate a book, I will just say it, right? That's what I've done in previous BookTube Prize ranking videos that I've done for the Nonfiction Prize. Also, just to spoil it, the books that did make it to the next round were Take My Hand, The Book of Goose, and The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. 2 of those were in my top 3, and you'll find out what those were. And the one for my top 3 that didn't make it, I'm actually really bummed about, because I did really love that book. I thought it was really interesting, and it was actually my favorite book. It was the one that I ranked the highest, but I know how it goes with these things. Everyone has a different set of feelings about the books that they read in their groups. And so I think compared to my experience with the Nonfiction Prize, where there have been some rounds where what I voted for as my top 3 and what actually made it were the complete opposite. Overall, I'm pretty content with this outcome and how it stacks up against what I actually voted for. So book number 6 is Either Or by Elif Batuman, and this is a sequel to her book The Idiot, which is about this college-age girl named Celine who is at Harvard. And I haven't read The Idiot. One of the things they asked us for the BookTube Prize is that if we're reading a sequel like this one, to just kind of judge it as a book on its own. So I haven't read The Idiot. I'm assuming it's about her freshman year, because this is about her sophomore year. And so it's about the experience of being a college sophomore, but it's also, of course, also about a lot of her personal things, stuff boys, parties, friends, literary gatherings, relationship with her mother, is all of those normal college angsty sort of things, but woven in with Celine's way of processing a lot of what she's been reading, whether for class or on her own. So there's this kind of literary analysis component to the book as well, but it's woven through the story of this character as she's drawing parallels between what she's going through and what she's reading in her various books. I ranked this last, but to be honest, there's a part of me that feels like I could learn to love this book. It just wasn't going to happen on the time frame of the BookTube Prize. It is a sequel, so there is some possibility that maybe I just don't have some of the context or attachment to the character you might need from the first book. But I think the real issue is just that I don't think right now I'm the right audience for this kind of book about a college-age girl at Harvard who's finding the meaning of her life through her literature coursework. And especially this book makes so many references to other great classics kind of works that I haven't read. And so at times I almost felt like I needed a separate syllabus to kind of engage with this book fully, and I just couldn't do that. But the reason why I feel like I could learn to love this book is because I loved the writing. I couldn't always fully engage with it, but when I did, I was so in love with it. It has this comic but dark kind of tone to it, and there are these moments of insight that Celine has that are so funny but also really interesting to unpack. There's actually a section on orgasms that I'm kind of obsessed with, because I was I have never heard this stated this way, but it's kind of fascinating to see it articulated the way that the book does, and I just loved it. And the book had so many moments like that I was oh, I could get there with this book. It's just it's not happening with me with this story and with this character right now, because I just cannot care when we're setting aside the insights in those kind of moments. So compared to the other books that I read for the BookTube Prize for this round, it just had a much harder sell for me, and that's ultimately why it's at the bottom of the list. But with that said, I do think that there's a future where maybe I will return to this book, or maybe actually go read The Idiot first and see if that helps me get some of the original story context, if maybe I have some more time to sit with it, maybe if I listen to it on audiobook or something. Maybe there's a way that this book will work for me, and I would love for that to happen because I love the writing. So maybe in the future I will come back to this and I will love it a lot more. So book number 5 for me was Take My Hand. And this book is a historical fiction novel, but it's inspired by real events. In the book, we're following a Black nurse named Sybil Townsend in Alabama in 1973. She's working at a family planning clinic, and one of her assignments is to be giving birth control shots to 2 young Black girls named Erica and India. And basically, she realizes in the process of doing this, like, this is weird, this is fucked up, and it's like part of this larger eugenics system that is actually in reality, like in our historical reality, a part of America's history. Take My Hand was sort of like the opposite experience of Either Or for me, because the premise of this is really a very easy sell for me. Like, taking a book that is about reproductive justice, that's about like putting that in this historical framework of eugenics and how it actually happened in the US and how people actually fought back against eugenics policies in the US. Like, all of that is something that I find really interesting. It's something like that I just, I find it to be a really compelling premise for a book, either nonfiction or fiction. And as someone who usually would probably have read about it more likely in nonfiction, for me it was really interesting to actually engage with it in this fictional context instead. What was difficult for me, though, was actually the writing. I felt like couldn't really fully flesh out that promise of what fiction could do for exploring this subject. The biggest strength for me by far with this book is the character of Sybil Townsend, our main point of view character. She's this Black nurse. She's having to deal with like this profession that she went into because, both because of privileges that she's had in her family because of class, but also because she really believes in it and she really wants people to have access to family planning. And it's also something that's reflected in her own personal reality, because we find out early on that she has had in the past an abortion. And so she has these kind of complicated thoughts about like what that choice looked like for her and how it fit in with her personal and professional choices and how it impacted some of her relationships. So I thought a lot of Sybil's story was really just super well done, and I liked her character arc throughout the book and how she's sort of starting to understand the ways that she's complicit in a policy that she like doesn't support. She just didn't necessarily immediately realize what it was a part of, like what her actions, what she was being asked to do, what they were a part of. And so I think that journey for her to understand what she's doing as a nurse and how it's like, in support of something else and how ultimately like she wants to fight back against that, I think was really well done in the book. And I think that speaks to the other like great strength of this book, which is the amount of care and research that was clearly put into understanding and depicting the medical and legal aspects of what was going on, which again are inspired by real world events. The trade-off though was that the book started to feel like it was beginning to use fiction to sort of connect the dots between real events and real life people, rather than something that was necessarily like a well executed story on its own. It actually reminded me a lot of my experience with The Overstory by Richard Powers, which a lot of people love. So, that's not necessarily a bad comparison or like an insulting comparison in general. Like, a lot of people love The Overstory, and clearly a lot of people love Take My Hand. It made it to the next round. But one of the things, I did actually a video review of The Overstory, and one of the things that I really struggled with that book was I just like didn't understand the point of the fiction in that book, because it just felt like that book was at its core a nonfiction book about trees, and this book felt like at its core that it was a nonfiction book about eugenics in America. And so layering this like fictional element on top of it could work, but because there's such a commitment to like conveying all of these actual real things about the subject matter, it just began to feel like that took precedence over also shaping the story around that, if that makes sense. And I have to give this book a little bit of allowance, because obviously it did some fictional aspect of the story really well, because I really enjoyed the character of Sybil Townsend. I thought she was a really compelling, complicated figure in the book as a narrator and as a character as well in her story. But a lot of the other characters just didn't stand out quite as vividly, and obviously, it's told from her point of view, but I still felt like there was something just missing from a lot of these characters, especially Erica and India. So it just made that like kind of fictional aspect fall a little bit flat for me. And it meant that like a lot of the aspects of the story felt like it wasn't really driven by anything. Like it was just kind of happening, and it was driven by the need to draw these historical parallels rather than having something that made sense or that like kind of stacked on top of something that made sense in the context of this fictional world. So yeah, it's kind of like hard to explain because like I really respect the role that fiction is playing in this book as a way to approach this like really horrific time in in American history, in medicine, in science in particular. Like there are a lot of aspects to the story that we can talk about all day long in like the actual facts, and being able to use fiction to explore that means that we can start to explore the actual emotional consequences and like the human element of that in a way that like cold hard facts may not necessarily give you in the same way. So I think there's like a lot of value to the way that this book is choosing to explore this topic. It just didn't all fully land for me. So on to book number 4, we have Lucy by the Sea. This is a pandemic book. It's about a recently widowed writer named Lucy, whose ex-husband William, at like right before the start of lockdown and everything, is like, hey, I think this is gonna be pretty bad. And so he gets her to go with him from her Manhattan apartment to a small town in Maine during lockdown. I had no idea how I was gonna feel about a pandemic book, right? Like I haven't really read one, and it took me some time to appreciate both the setting and the writing, but once I did, I really enjoyed this book. I usually struggle with books that are not heavily driven by story. Like books like this that are more driven by character and mood, I sometimes like just don't care as much about, but A, I think I'm changing. I think as I get older, I'm starting to appreciate those kinds of books more, but B, I think this book just did a really good job with the mood and the characters, and I really got invested in just seeing where it was all going. I described the writing and the plotting as very economical, like not a whole lot of frills, and a lot of the pandemic aspects, you know, they kind of just, they go as you expect, right? Like there's someone unmasked who gets COVID, there's unfriendly locals, there's COVID deniers, there's like complications from sickness and all of this stuff. So like a lot of the book is familiar. Like it's just familiar from the experience that we have all collectively gone through in our own specific ways just like a few years ago, right? Like this huge, massive collective experience. So there is a way that that could have been boring, but I think because the book is so economical with the way that it's describing them and like leading up to it and everything, where you're like, I see where this is going. It just like, it all flows and works and just happens. And you're just like, yep, that's what I expected. At the same time, even though like, you know, there's this big collective experience, like I said, we all had kind of, you know, our own individual experiences. And so Lucy and William are older characters. So for me, like they're having a very different experience of the pandemic, both in terms of what the risk is to them, but also how they're relating to the experience of being together as exes, but also having kids who are grown up and are dealing with like their own marital issues and that are complicated by the pandemic. So there's just all of these experiences of the pandemic that are inherently different from my own. I think the part of the book that I loved the most was Lucy's relationship with her daughters, which is, you know, complicated the way that a lot of mother-daughter relationships often are, because they're shaped by the fact that like the mother knows they've brought their daughter into a world that is going to have these certain set of shitty choices for them to deal with and certain types of pain that they might have to deal with. But I thought the book just did such a, I don't know, it was like an emotional gut punch several times in this book as we like watch the ways that Lucy and her daughters like learn to relate to each other through like really difficult circumstances and complicated ones and ones that they don't necessarily agree on, but that just, you know, through the experience of the pandemic and being kind of forced to be apart, you know, also, you know, brings them closer together maybe in some ways, and the way that like we all hope that maybe having been forced to go through lockdown did for some of our relationships. So I enjoyed Lucy by the Sea a lot more than I thought I was going to enjoy a pandemic novel. So now we are in my top 3. Third book was The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, and this is a retelling of H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, only it's told through the perspective of Carlotta Moreau, his daughter, and a worker for him, Montgomery Lawton, and they all live on this secluded estate on the Yucatan Peninsula while Dr. Moreau is doing his hybrid animal-human experiments that are like, you know, just bound for disaster. I've never read The Island of Dr. Moreau, so I can't speak to how much it would have helped to give maybe more context or maybe more details that would like fill in stuff with this book, but also, luckily, I don't think I really missed much. I mean, maybe I did. If you have read The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Daughter of Dr. Moreau and you felt like they like really made good, I don't know, joint readings, like let me know. I'd love to know if there was ways that having read the original story like influenced the way you read this one. I would love to know what that looked like. But yeah, luckily I don't think I missed too much because I really love this book. It does help that this is the fourth Sylvia Moreno Garcia book I've read, and I think it might be my second favorite after Mexican Gothic. I think the main thing is just that I love a good bio sci-fi Sylvia Moreno Garcia book. I don't read a lot of sci-fi, but whenever I read hers, I'm like, I should be doing this more. Like, I really like this. Like, that was my experience of Mexican Gothic, which gets so fucking bonkers and weird, and I was just in love with it. I loved the way that whole book went down and the way that it incorporated biology into the other batshit stuff happening in that book. But what I especially love is the way that she mixes sci-fi with history and turns these like ethical and biological questions of the science into an examination of other issues of the time. And like I said with Mexican Gothic, she has like no issues with letting things get weird, even when they're like grounded in a very, very real historical setting. And I think that's related to the other thing I'm starting to realize that I really appreciate about her writing, which is her willingness to write these very messy protagonists. It's very true for this book. Carlotta, like, there's a lot of ways in which, you know, she is like a heroine who you like can root for, but there are a lot of ways in which she has her blind spots when it comes to her father, and like the way that her relationships with her father and her relationships with her hybrids are like conflicting at times. Like, she doesn't always want to fully engage with that. She's manipulative in a way that I really like loved, and it's like very clear. And I think like that's all done without judgment. It's not done with the intent of being like this character's bad or whatever. It's just done with the intent of portraying this character as she is. And I really enjoy when when an author can just like lean in to how, you know, off-putting a character might be at sometimes while being really endearing at others. Montgomery should be this total sad sack of a man, and yet I found his sad sackness oddly dynamic, and I really enjoyed seeing it intersect with Carlotta's story over the course of this book. Then we're getting to my second favorite book, and this was The Book of Goose. This is about a French girl named Agnès. She is growing up in the French countryside post-World War II, and she conspires with her best friend Fabienne basically to become published authors. And when we start the book, we're actually kind of like flash forward into the future where Agnès is a woman now living in America, and she's just learned that Fabienne has died. And so over the course of the book, she's explaining how she and Fabienne kind of came up with a scheme and how it ultimately resulted in Agnès's life going on this very distinct trajectory where she got like this momentary burst of fame, and how kind of it all intersected with, in particular, her friendship with Fabienne. I love this book. I loved this book. First of all, I love the cover. So cool. But in particular, I listened to this book on audiobook, and it was narrated by Caroline Hewitt, and I just thought she did a fantastic job. This is not going to sound like a compliment, but I swear it is. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I like to put on an audiobook to soothe me, to calm me down. And I think this might go into the rotation just because her narration was so good. It was just so pleasing. And it's like matched by this like very melodious writing style that's in the book. So like it just like all worked together so well. And so like I think it's going to be very good for sending me to sleep when I need to, but obviously, that's not what I was trying to do with the BookTube Prize. I was trying to read the book, and while I was actively listening to it, it had my attention fully because I just thought she did such a good job with the narration. There is a chance that the audiobook narration may have slightly kind of influenced the way that I viewed this book overall. It may have like brought out an enjoyment that I don't know, because like I don't have the counterfactual, like that maybe I wouldn't have gotten if I just read the book in print form, because I just think Hewitt did such a good job of bringing out Agnes's voice, like from this kind of adult perspective, where she's like a little bit wiser, a little bit wistful, but she's also still got a little bit of this naivete that like we see in the way that she describes herself as a younger girl. And so all of that just like fully came together, I thought, in that performance, and just brought the book to life in a way that I really loved. So if you're thinking about reading this book, I would highly recommend the audiobook. This book is inspired by the actual story of French prodigies, and there is a part of me that kind of wants to compare this to my experience of reading Take My Hand, which is also very much inspired by actual historical things. That's probably not a very fair comparison to make, because I think the entire purpose of these books are very different. I think like Take My Hand is inherently motivated by this need to bring historical events to life so that we can like understand issues of injustice in our world, whereas in my reading of the Book of Goose, I don't think there's really that much interest in like getting people to understand the human cost of like these horrible injustices that have actually happened in the world. I think it's much more done with the idea of exploring these two characters, exploring their relationship, and like kind of exploring it in these set of circumstances, but not necessarily like feeling super tied down to all of the details that, I don't know, would actually shape the life of a French peasant girl in the countryside who suddenly finds herself bursting onto the literary scene. So I said it's an unfair comparison, but I just wanted to make that point because I think what this book is much more focused on is, like I said, about Fabienne and Agnes's relationship. Fabienne is much more of the savvy one, but it also means that of the two of them, she is like very aware of why Agnes is the one that needs to be pushed into the spotlight and not her. And while Agnes is like more passive, it is her observations and descriptions of the events that like propel her that ultimately, you know, they fill this book. Like the book is built around Agnes, and so it reveals like this deeper well within her that the people around her don't necessarily see. And I think just seeing that play out in the course of the story and with the writing that is used to kind of like support the actual characters and like flesh them out, it just all came together super well for me. In general, I think of the books in this section overall, I would say that The Book of Goose and The Daughter of Dr. Moreau were the ones to me that felt maybe the plottiest. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they're like both in my top 3. And I think the thing about The Book of Goose that edged it out just a little bit more than The Daughter of Dr. Moreau is just how much that writing drew me into the inner monologue of the character, and especially this character who doesn't otherwise reveal that much to the people around her. So seeing that distinction between how she perceives the events versus how like people are responding to her, just I really enjoyed that tension throughout that book. So my favorite book of all of these was Vagabonds, and I get why Vagabonds didn't make it through. Just because starting off, I don't know how to fully describe this book. It's technically a novel, but to me it felt more like a very, very well-connected set of short stories set in Nigeria, and with these stories that explore queerness and religion and corruption and death and all of these different things through spirits and mythological creatures whose lives intertwine with humans, or maybe more like humans whose lives intertwine with like the fantastical. I just said all this stuff about how my favorite books in the section were the plotty ones. Vagabonds is really not that plot heavy. Like this is a character book. This is a mood book to the core. And like I said, I don't know how to fully even describe this book. I like looking back, I know that I have like only grasped like a tenth of what this book was doing. And yet this is the book that I love the most because it's the one that felt the most like an experience. Like I just loved the experience of reading this book in a way that was so unique and specific to this book, and in a way that like none of the other books in this section were going to be able to give me, and that was just really exciting. What I loved was the way that the book mixes myth and fantasy with these personal human stories at the center of it all, but like even saying that doesn't really feel like it does the book justice. There's one line that I made note of while I was reading, and I just still really love it, and it's about love. And here's the quote: 3 years in, and she still cried in surprise sometimes when she realized the solidity of this thing, how well and how often it could catch her weight, how horizonless the kindness was. And, this is a moment where she's talking about a relationship, she's talking about love, and there's just so many different ways that this book approaches the topic of love and of relationships and of loneliness, and just there's so many moments like that. Like, maybe it's sort of like a little bit like my experience of reading Either Or, where there are these moments of insight that I just really liked having a moment to kind of pause and appreciate both what that sentence was saying and also the way it was saying it. I was trying to parse through because saying I don't know how to describe this book, it's not very helpful. And I was trying to parse through what it is about it that I really loved. And it all kind of slowly started making a little bit more sense when I was actually on a plane watching Netflix. I was catching up very late on The Sandman, which is the series based on Neil Gaiman's comic book series, The Sandman. And I remember reading that comic book series a long time ago. And one of the things that I remember is just finding it so dense and at times kind of hard to fully, what's the word? Dive into. That's not the word. Whatever. It was dense and a little obscure to me at times, what it was doing, but I still loved reading it because I just really liked the way that the story moved, and I liked the way that the characters were talking. I liked the writing in it. Just there was something about reading The Sandman that was an experience, and watching the show reminded me a lot of that experience because that is, what the show is doing. You're jumping around from character to character with this very Neil Gaiman-esque writing. All of it just comes together in a way that I really found to be an immersive experience, just like with Vagabonds. They're both works that rely on mythology and metaphor to tell these episodic stories that connect on a very, very human level. And at times it's kind of hard to see what all of those connections are, but the actual experience of those episodes is still so immersive, and it's still so visceral and emotional. It gives you something to hold on to, even if you're not fully grasping the big picture. So yeah, I'm a little disappointed that Vagabonds didn't make it through, even though I kind of understand it. Again, it is its own experience, and maybe that's not for everyone, the way that there's probably people who had the complete opposite rankings of me with this booktube prize reading. So yeah, I get it. And I think, coming out of it, I don't feel like I fully understood the book, but it's definitely the book that was the most memorable reading experience of all of these for me. So I really loved it. So yeah, those are my feelings on the booktube prize, Octafinals Fiction Section B, and I am now reading for the Nonfiction quarterfinal. So that's going to be exciting, and I will get back to you guys in 2 months, I guess, with my thoughts on those. So yeah, thanks you guys for watching. If you've read these books, let me know what you've thought about them, and yeah, bye.